Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Apartment Department, the podcast for multifamily marketers by multifamily marketers. My name is Ann Baum. I am one of the co-hosts. I am currently the marketing director at Town Properties, a property management company in Cincinnati, Ohio. My co-host is Chris Johnson. He is currently a marketing leader in the property management industry in Dallas, Texas. And we are very, very excited today to have a guest, the founder of Flamingo, Jude Chiy. Jude, welcome. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Anna and Chris. I'm really excited to be here, especially to chat a little bit more with Chris because we have had a lot of ongoing conversations and really excited to meet Anne officially as well too.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I've known Chris for about 2.5 years now, and since the beginning, he has always been like, you have to use Flamingo, you have to use Flamingo, you have to ask Jude about all of his knowledge. So I'm glad that I finally get the opportunity to do that. So before we dive into today's topics of really branding and resident retention and satisfaction, because I know those are really, I follow you on LinkedIn and I always see you posting about those two things. And I know you're really passionate about them. Can you talk to us a little bit about Flamingo and what you do and how you got so passionate about why you're passionate enough to start Flamingo?
Yeah, absolutely. So for Flamingo, we are basically a resident retention platform. Our whole goal is to help our customers keep their residents for much longer. And we see brand as the ultimate form of retention. As you know, in the industry, retention is about 50%. But if you look across all industry as a whole, the average retention is about 75%. I always make the comment to our customers that Flamingo or property management is very similar to software, where you have a customer that pays you a monthly fee and they have an annual contract. And during the time they sign their lease or they sign their contract, the time they decide to keep staying with you, you have that golden opportunity to make them decide if they are going to stay longer or not. In the software industry, if I were to go to, we are a software company, if I went to our investors and told them that we lose 50% of our customers every year, I would be instantly fired. But in property management, it's just accepted that 50% retention is a good thing, when for me, it's frankly not. Data that we see from the Flamingo side proves exactly that. We can talk about that a little bit more. Why some of the reasons residents move out, very, very solvable. And our data shows that about 50% of turnover is insanely controllable. So property managers have this really golden opportunity to drive retention. And part of that is through branding and all the things that companies all over the world have done to really create a brand that consumers align with.
Jude, why do you think we're so far behind in the apartment industry on brand compared to hotels and some of the others?
Yeah, I think for several reasons. One of them is by the nature of property management. So in property management and housing as a whole, people need a place to live. So housing isn't a desire. It's an absolute need. People cannot just opt out hey, I don't need a house. The same way that you can say, I don't need to drink Coke. I don't need to actually have a car. So in industries where the consumers view it more as something that they don't necessarily need, companies in those spaces are much more competitive because they have to constantly create the need for people to want that product. And there's just a lot more competition. Whereas in housing, there just isn't if you need an apartment, you need a place to live. Whereas for a car or for soda or a lot of other consumer goods, you don't necessarily need that. Because of that, those companies just have a much stronger need to build a brand to drive that desire. So a real example is you can have someone travel 3,000 miles from the US to Asia and they order a Coke, even though they have traveled to a completely different land where they went there specifically for a completely different experience. So in industries where the desire or need isn't as strong as in housing, those companies just have a much stronger need to have to brand. Well, because in apartments, they don't have that. They always make money somehow. That need hasn't been as strong. It's also why in property management, there hasn't been as big of a need to implement technology. Whereas for other companies, the needs of technology is much stronger just because competition is much, much stronger.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
And do you have any follow-ups? Because I do.
No, no, just I hadn't thought of it that way before. That's really fascinating. Yeah, like
But Jude,
what?
how do we get there? Like, so yes, it's a necessity, but we still want to keep people and we still want to treat them right. We still care about them staying. So what can we do to enhance the brand? And what do you say? I mean, obviously there's some big players in our industry and they have a brand, but what do you say to the smaller players that maybe have just niche and they're in a region, for example, or they're in a couple of regions or they're scattered throughout the Sun Belt? Like, how can we be better? Do you have any tips? Have you done some research? What do you see?
So I feel like I'll hit that in different phases. So one of the biggest things that I think needs to change is for the industry to really understand that retention is possible, like high retention and high branding is like possible. So I definitely get a lot of comments from people that are like, well, I don't think having a brand is going to help us, or I don't think it's possible for us to actually have a brand that consumers care about, or I don't think it's actually going to make a difference. I think over the next few years, I am really excited to see the companies that right now are kind of laying the field work to build a brand, and for those companies to start talking about how it's actually impacted their conversion rates, their traffic, all the things that right now are extremely expensive. It always reminds me of this like story for the Olympics are coming up, but a really long time ago, most runners were always above like a 4-minute mile. So no one had really like broken the 4-minute mile for a very, very long time until this guy, Roger Bannister, came along and ran the first sub 4-minute mile. And then within just a few weeks, a bunch of runners all ran under 4 minutes. So for a very long time, people had this limiting belief that it's just like not possible to run under like 4 minutes. So in the same way, when you think about retention and when you think about brand, the industry right now still has this like limited belief that it doesn't really matter. But once you have a few companies that prove that, oh, our conversion rates have improved by like 150%, simply because we are now a well-known brand, you see that flip immediately in the industry where a lot more companies start doing it. And we see that across the board in the industry where a few decades ago, gyms were not a thing in the apartment industry. Like no one had a gym. No one believed that there was a reason to have a gym. A few companies added a gym. And then within the last like 30 years, we went from gyms to fitness centers to now we have like real health clubs that a lot of companies like have. And now having something like that is basically a standard in the industry. So the same way, we are going to see that happen with brands where once a few companies have proven it out, a lot more companies are going to be like, oh, that's possible to really have a brand. And then to your second question about, is a brand only accessible by a large multinational or multi-city property management company? Can a smaller regional company own a brand? Like, yeah, absolutely. So if you look at car dealerships, if you go to any city and you ask someone like, hey, name a car dealership, a lot of people can name like a local car dealership. And what do those car dealerships do to have like a local brand or local presence? They have a bunch of billboards. They have a bunch of like late night ads, and they have like their name just kind of plastered everywhere. They haven't really done a crazy thing to build a brand. All they have done is just like put their name out there where people are. So for those like regional players, yeah, it's absolutely possible to have a super regional and super niche brand. The same way too, if you go to most cities, you ask people for, hey, name like a I don't know, like an accident lawyer. Most people can name it. I don't live in Vegas, but I know like local like Vegas, like traffic or accident
Yeah.
lawyers. Just because when I go to Vegas, they always think there's signs like everywhere. That's how simple as it is to build a brand. Like a brand is just something for at the very bare minimum, it's something that someone can recall. And just by human design, if you can remember something or if you can recall something, you automatically ascribe trust, more trust to it than something you've never heard before. That's why Coke, after like being around for over 100 years and everyone and their mom knowing what Coke is, they still spend like billions of dollars in marketing just so people like know the name constantly. So for regional brands, they can absolutely do it. And for me, why I get so excited about these types of things is that for a long time, I spoke about brand and there really weren't a lot of signs for it. But the last like few years, I see the signs like constantly people in the industry starting to like do it. So at NAA a couple of weeks ago, Gold, so they are a property management company, they had a booth. So the same way that a supplier can have a booth, they set up a booth. And I was like, that is so freaking interesting. I actually had a chance to talk with them and they explained this is what they are trying to do. And then I kid you not, I was Bollywood last night. So Bollywood is a festival, like a volleyball festival in Chicago at like North Avenue Beach. And one of the sponsors of Bollywood was Group Fox Management, which is the first company that managed an apartment building when I first moved to Chicago. And they were one of the sponsors. So they were the sponsor along with regular like consumer brands. Like they had, I think like a salsa company and a bunch of other like traditional like beverage that you see sponsor like festivals. But Group Fox, they sponsored it. And it wasn't like they were like Group Fox Management or Group Fox whatever apartments. It just had like the Group Fox like name. So it's just like those small things. But Group Fox is like very much like a Chicago property management company that many people don't really know about. But by just having their name, like a festival that was attended by thousands of people, they have gotten a bunch like brand impressions. So for those kids that were there, those adults, all of those people, the next time that they are looking for an apartment, they will see like on apartments.com, they will see all the names of all the different companies. Like they look at this apartment, they see that it's managed by X company. They see another one managed by Group Fox. Immediately they make that association like, oh, I have seen Group Fox like somewhere else. Just by that, they have a smaller affiliation. So there are a lot of things that those smaller players can do to build a brand. And it really matters because we have a move out survey that asks people why they moved out. And what we see is the reasons are pretty basic, but we also ask people like where they ended up. And in about 37% of the cases, people are still renting in the same city. So on a new lease. So for regional brands, they have that great opportunity to capture and keep all of those residents still within the same like portfolio, even if it is just like within the same region. So it absolutely like matters. And the smaller players can absolutely build brands that work really regionally. So if your car dealership can do it, I'm sure an apartment management company can do it as well too.
That's amazing. I now have a car commercial running through my head from to McCluskey Chevrolet. They do a great job. I'm like, their jingles in my mind. And I think I'm glad that you brought up Gold Dollar because you're right. That's been all over that they really did something different. And it reminds me a lot about your story about the 4-minute mile all of a sudden, becoming the 3+ minute mile because someone else did it. And so Gold has set a standard and allowed us as management companies to kind of think differently. And now it's up to us to start kind of following that charge. How important do you think branding the property management brand versus the individual community? Like, how do companies strike a balance between the two concepts?
Yeah, I think at the high level, I always recommend companies put the management company brand or the portfolio brand more forward than the individual like building brand. And the reason behind that is because like when you think about a brand, you always want people to think about it from the much like greater perspective. So even though I just said that for the smaller players, it really matters to build our regional brand. But part of that is when people are aware something is bigger, they just have like a strong affiliation to it. So if they know that, oh, this is just one of hundreds of company or hundreds of communities that this company owns, they just feel instantly good about it. Like, oh, I'm part of something great.
Yeah.
It's just like human nature and how people like feel. So for me, at the if I could recommend it to any company, I think a company should name their buildings like the same thing. It's what hotels have done. So Hilton, it's named Hilton wherever you go. As much as companies can have the same names for their buildings, that will be I would say the ceiling. But it's not possible. And then at least make it really clear who the management company is. So if I were a company owner or an apartment company owner, the first thing that I'll do if my buildings are all named different would be to either convert them to all be the same name. If I'm not able to do that because I'm a third party and I want to keep the names different, I'll just add like managed by X in front of the building somewhere. So just having that is going to help build a brand very quickly. Right now at Flamingo, we are doing like a brand study. It's like a mix of qualitative and quantitative brand study. So we go to different cities where we go to a popular place in that city. Like in Boston, we went to the Boston Commons. In that city, we asked people that are walking around like, hey, can you name 3 car brands? And most people are able to say Audi, BMW, Toyota. And then we say, can you name 3 hotel brands? They can do the Hiltons, the Ritz, the Marriott. We ask them, can you name 3 soda brands? They can name like the Coke, Pepsi, Sprite. And then we ask them, can you name 3 apartment brands? People that live in apartments, they are not able to. Like, it's just like shocking. Like, they don't know who the management company is, even though they interact with the management team on a regular basis. For the last study that we did, one really interesting thing that came about is people were able to name specific buildings in their city. So someone was like, oh, yeah, I kind of walk by this apartment every single day and the name of it is X. So they can name the apartment building itself or community itself, but they don't know who the management company is. But the reason they can name the apartment community is because the name of the community is slapped somewhere in the building, right? So the way to just build that brand affiliation is so simple. It's as small as just at the name, because you have like thousands of impressions like every week of people just walking by the building. And just by doing that, they become aware of who the management company is. So I think for me, that's one of the fastest ways that affiliation can be built. And the preference would always be to the management company rather than to the specific community.
Okay, I think that's good advice. I saw I'm not going to get her title right now, but her name was Shruti, and she was the VP of brand at Hampton Inns by Hilton, and she talked a lot about that kind of scenario that you were just saying, that, you know, ultimately you do want all of your properties branded, in that case by Hampton, but Hilton also has a couple soft brands where each of the hotels is named something individual, but then they're able to bring in elements of the Hilton brand through experience and some visual aspects and some centralization of booking. And so I think what you're saying for third-party owners, that it is possible to have those two live together, but being deliberate about putting the property management company name front and center. So it's so much to think about. Chris, what do you think?
I mean, I think it's great advice, Jude. I think you're taking us down a good path, and I think we can be more intentional about what we're doing with our residents, because we do interact with them, whether it's maintenance orders or coming to the office, maybe it's events, whatever it is, we're interacting, and we want to make that stay as great as possible. It's where they live, which leads me into how retention plays into brand. And what are you seeing on the event side? What are you seeing for retention? I mean, is there anything out there that's different that you're seeing companies do that you're like, wow, that was out of the box? That's cool.
Yeah. So there is a lot on that end. To your question, and I'm glad that you asked about events particularly, because it's interesting to me right now. everyone thinks about events being like their driver for retention. When like Flamingo has an event marketplace, we do thousands of events. So some of that loves resident events. But the truth is, events are a very small part of what impacts our retention. So we also did a study where we asked people, or for our move out surveys, we asked the different elements that drove them to either renew or not renew. And the sense of community was only about 4% of the reason that people gave for why they either renewed or did not renew. So everyone right now is using events as the one clutch or the one driver for retention, or the most proactive element of retention. But from our data, from the studies we've done, it's just like the smallest piece. What we have found to be the much bigger pieces for why people renew or not renew are things that are completely different. So a huge, what we see is about 50% of the controllable elements of retention are focused around the management team. So residents complain a lot about the management team. That's probably like the biggest driver. So management team, which segments into a few different things, including customer service and communication. So it's like, hey, I sent an email to the management team and no one responded to me for like 3 or 4 days, or just did not get a reply at all.
Oh my
And
goodness.
it's not a fault of the management team. It's because they don't have the tools to actually manage communication. So I've seen companies dedicate like $2,000-$3,000 on resident rents. I'm like, oh my God, your Google reviews just immediately show that you have really terrible communication with your residents. Spend $300 on a ticketing system, and this will solve all of that. So in property management, everyone has some type of tool for maintenance requests because they want to keep their maintenance teams like organized. But when it comes to like the other elements of communication, it's all managed via email. So the maintenance team has like a really great tool to manage tickets, which are basically maintenance requests. But the other tickets are office tickets, which is like, hey, how do I renew my lease? All those things that residents like email about. So for those things, residents just send an email and those get lost in the multiple inboxes that teams like have. If companies just invested in a ticketing system for the office, the same way that they have invested in a ticketing system for the maintenance team, that would drastically improve the resident experience. And ticketing systems are not expensive. So rather than spend, we do a lot of events. I'm completely advocating for people to not do events. Rather than spend that $3,000 on events, like invest in a ticketing system, that would drastically improve the resident experience.
Does Flamingo Does Flamingo have a ticketing system built in now?
Yeah, we do have a ticketing system. So it's one of the first things that we build right out of the box. So part of how I started Flamingo is I spent about 4 months where I walked to every apartment in Chicago. So from like 8 to 5, I would go to every single apartment building, stop there, talk to the front desk, talk to the residents, talk to the property manager, just to assess like what their biggest struggles are, what they do. And that's kind of how Flamingo got created, from all that information that we learned from the on-site team. So they have way too many tools that they have to manage.
Yep.
Residents complain about communication and all the apps they have to log into. So we really created Flamingo with an all-in-one app, and 2, we just replaced a lot of single point solutions that companies have implemented, and then added a lot of the different things that most other companies like have. So initially I had mentioned that property managers need to kind of think about their business similar to how like tech companies think about their business. So for Google, as an example, if you need help with Google, you submit a ticket. You don't email Google because they get like thousands of those things. So tech companies have implemented all of these like great systems to help them offer like a much better customer experience. And property management just has not. So a lot of what we have built is around that. And what we see for our customers is once those things are implemented, it really puts a plug on what we call retention leak. So retention leak are all the things that get people to want to move out. So it could be, like I said, you send an email and the management team doesn't respond for like 3 or 4 days. And leadership just has no idea that it's that small piece that's really like messing up their retention.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of those different types of things that we see. So 50% of retention is fully like solvable or fully controllable.
How much does it do to maintenance?
Very little, at least for the companies that we work with. So from our data, maintenance is typically a driver of retention, whereas I hate to say this, whereas the office team's a detractor to retention. And again, it's not the fault of the office team. Like maintenance has a great tool. So for all the companies that we work with, maintenance turnaround times are probably typically within like 2 days or so. And maintenance like satisfaction is typically around like 4.6 out of 5. Office team satisfaction is about 3.7 or so. So from all of our data, maintenance is a driver of retention, whilst like the office team typically is a detractor to retention.
So that's controllable. It's interesting.
Yeah, so it's super controllable. And again, it's the tooling. So the maintenance team, they already have a great tool to use. The office team kind of given the same tool. And that's why I love the retention topic, because it's such a simple fix. And it's not like, oh, spend $3,000 on events. It's literally like offer better customer service, and it's very possible.
I think that's very interesting too, because we started our conversation about looking at other industries for benchmarks, right? And you use software as an example that a retention rate of 75% is normal. And so I think taking that and applying the idea of that as property management companies, we could go from 50% to 75%. And it's about looking at the data. It's about looking at what is causing our residents to not renew, and then start implementing step by step fixes to those issues. And slowly we will start to see our retention rates climb. And I love that. I think you're right that it is a lot of times like, oh, well, let's just throw some events, which are really important. But it sounds like there are other drivers that you have to go through first before kind of assuming that, oh, well, we're not throwing enough events, therefore people are leaving. So that's, do you have any other data around resident retention that you think it's important for our listeners to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot.
I'm sure you have.
Yeah. So this data also comes from, you have to over-survey your residents. So a lot of companies right now, they do like an annual or like a biannual survey. If you look at software companies, if you've ever taken an Uber or Lyft, you get a survey after every single ride, like after every single ride. So for apartments, you have to map out your resident journey and look at for each element, like, hey, we need to make sure that we have a survey after this. So after someone does a tour, after someone applies, after someone moves in, after someone has been there for a few days, after a work order, after an event, after a renewal, after a move out once a month, asking like how happy they are or how likely are they to renew. So you have to measure every single element of that experience, including after staff communication. So most companies right now just don't survey their residents enough. The simplest thing is just survey people a lot more to start capturing that data so you can solve issues like way more proactively. On the retention front, the other things that we see are people move out because they don't know the options available to them. So a quick fun story is I like to go into Flamingo site data just to see what's going on. A couple of years ago, I saw for one of our customers, one resident had completed the resident satisfaction survey at the same time that they completed their renewal intent survey. So the resident satisfaction survey is a monthly survey we send residents. And then the renewal intent is another monthly survey that we send them, asking them how likely are you to renew. So for this particular resident, Charlie, I should fully remember his name. On his resident satisfaction survey, he gave the site a 5 out of 5. He said something like, the on-site team's great, they're super communicative, they're helpful, just very detailed, like how great his experience was. And then on his renewal intent, he gave it a 1 out of 5, like he's not going to renew. And the reason he gave is he needs a bigger unit because he just got engaged. I'm like, wait, what? So I forwarded that to the leasing agent. And he reached out to to Charlie and said, hey, we can just upgrade you to a larger unit. And that's all it took. Like, this was a resident that loved the building and just wanted something bigger, but the team just wasn't aware of it. And the resident himself wasn't aware that that option was available. So apartment companies tend to think that their residents are aware of all the options that are available to them. But the truth is, for a resident, their community is just like one part of their life. They have their job, they have all these things that are going on. They have not read your leasing agreement. They don't know your company exists, like that your company is like a greater thing. They don't know you have like a transfer policy. They just like don't know these things.
Because they're in their day to day. That makes total sense. Yeah. That's
so this is all just get him to transfer and stay within the same building. It was just like, hey, yeah, let's just transfer you to a larger unit and you actually pay us more money, which he was willing to do.
Right. Everyone wins. I think I've seen you talk too about the idea of like offering the option of transferring people across communities that are managed by your property management company. And I think that goes hand in hand with what you're talking about now, is just letting people know that that's an option. Where does that happen? Does that happen kind of in the renewal communication where you're giving your residents multiple options?
So we kind of see it as making the brand element obvious to the resident. So that's probably like the first step, is just make it obvious to residents that you are a brand. And as a brand, you have multiple options. And by default, the residents going to think, oh, yeah, so if I need to move, I can just like stay within this company. So if residents are aware, by default, they're probably going to proactively like ask. But if they don't, you also need to insert this along every single element of the journey. So for a lot of Flamingo customers, that's something that will fully like automated. So when we ask a resident, like, how likely are you to renew? And that could be 8 months before their lease is actually up for renewal. If the resident is like, yeah, I'm not going to renew, we ask them, why are you not going to renew? They tell us like, it's because I just got a job. I live in Chicago, but I just got a job in New York. Immediately, our system shows them what we call our inner ILS, which is an ILS within the Flamingo resident app that instantly shows them, oh, here are our available units in New York. And here are the ones that we think you are going to like because you spend a lot of time going to the fitness center at this specific community. And this one also has a really high level fitness center. You go to the fitness classes, here's another community that also has like fitness classes. So it's all along that same proactive approach. And then when it's the official lease offer, that's another place where you can insert that to say, here's your lease offer, but if for whatever reason you are not going to renew or you are not able to renew, here are other options for where you could transfer to. And we know that in like 67+% of cases, residents keep renting with a new lease, not even including people that are moving someone else that has an existing lease, which is even higher. So immediately you know that for someone that's moving out, they have a few options. They renew with you, they get into they keep renting with a new apartment company, or they bought a house. The bought a house is such a small part of it, so you know most likely they are going to keep renting. So you might as well proactively make them aware that you have other options for them in case the initial offer that you gave them isn't possible.
Okay. No, I love that. And I think it sounds like such an easy switch, right? Like just sending out more surveys, tailoring the communication that you're sending out to let residents know about their options. Something that just popped into my head too. We are regional, so we operate in 4 states, but in the case that someone was moving to a state that maybe we didn't operate in, the idea of maybe having like a referral, program with another regional property management company, like these things become possible when you're asking people questions, when you're communicating with residents, when you're thinking about how you want to implement change, like increasing residents. And it's really fascinating. Do you have any data around kind of like the cost of not retaining residents for property management companies?
So we haven't done our own like study, but there are a few that have been done out there. Just like informally have asked some of our customers, And we hear a range that's anywhere from like $3,000 up to $5,000 to replace a resident. So it's like quite high. It's quite high. And if you think about that in terms of NOI, and that's pretty high. So if for a company, you are able to impact, or if for a marketer or operator, if you are able to impact retention by adding like 5%, 10%, that's significant. That's millions of dollars in additional value that's added to one community. Then if you think about a portfolio, that's like millions and millions of dollars that's added in value to their like assets. So for me, I've been saying this for a very long time that retention just needs to become like part of the front. Like people have spent so much money on like leasing tools, so on the sales and marketing element, but they just have not done the same thing on the retention, which is why if you go to any community, you see a bunch of leasing agents, but you don't see a retention agent.
Yeah, that's I think that's something else I saw you post about, is that some of these larger companies now are hiring in experts from other industries to become kind of like resident experience leaders, customer experience leaders. So is that a trend that you would expect to trickle into property management?
Yeah, absolutely. So for one obvious reason, which is that it just costs a lot of money to lose a resident that you have kind of brought in. And the second reason is because people are staying like tenants or residents for much longer. So before, the traditional path was you graduate college, you get your first apartment, you might rent for like 8 or so years, and then you buy a condo or house. Now people are like renting into like their 40s, if not more. So for a company, you can literally get someone right out of college and keep them within your portfolio for the next like 20 years. So why wouldn't you dedicate that by just hiring a few people at a corporate level whose sole goal is to figure out ways to build that brand and make it really obvious to those residents that they can stay within your portfolio, whether it's through and incentivize them to stay within your portfolio, whether it's through like loyalty programs or rewards and all of that, because it's like a no-brainer to do. So I think a lot more companies are going to do that. And we see a few already doing that. And so one of the largest like property management companies, they've already hired people from like the Hilton. So speaking of following the hotel industry, they've already hired people over from like Hilton and a few other places that are kind of similar where the loyalty matters a lot. So I definitely expect to see that trend continue, because again, property management kind of follows what the big people are doing. So we should see that happen a lot more. What happens if a resident that you have is moving to a state that you don't have assets in? Like, could there be kind of a referral program? I think like absolutely, because again, I say the apartment industry is in some way similar to the software industry. And in the software industry, you kind of plug in systems like solutions that you don't have through like integrations.
Yes.
So if you are HubSpot and you don't have like a dialer, like a power dialer, you allow other companies that have power dialers to integrate within HubSpot, and your customers can kind of plug it in if they need a dialer, which is something you don't have. So in property management, you can kind of plug in other property management companies in states that you don't operate in to say, hey, if I have a resident that is moving out, I can refer them to you, and you either give me a fee, or we have like that referral relationship where if you have a resident that is moving to one of my states, you can send them over to me.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this now. I've kind of, what brought it up is we third party manage, and we have our owners sometimes work with multiple management companies based on the region that their property is in. And so it started making me think, and it's very clearly regional, right? Like they own properties in Minnesota. It's one company that is managing the properties in Minnesota, for example. And so it all of a sudden just made me think about like the regionality of, but you're right, people move all over the United States. So that's something interesting that I'll keep in the back of my brain there.
No, I always like thinking of property management very similar to like software. And for software, they have kind of figured out all those like little things. And that's what drives the experience, the retention, the brand, and all of that. So I think property management can fully replicate all those things pretty simply.
Okay. And I love that too, because you're right. There's a lot of times kind of the association of like property management following hospitality, but thinking about property management as a totally different industry and software industry is very fascinating. And I love that. So thank you for bringing that perspective. Is there anything else that you want our listeners to know, especially as they're going into budget season, which is happening pretty quickly? Is there anything else you want them to know about focusing on brand and resident satisfaction and retention?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as people kind of think through the budgets, like any industry, is really look at where the holes are. And like we've spoken about throughout this podcast, one of the biggest holes or leaks is like retention. So kind of siphon, again, I say this and this hurts me, but I say events are great. There are a lot of things that you can do to drive retention more so than events. Like we see customers that spend a very small amount on getting like a resident app. And again, we do provide resident apps, but I'm just advocating any resident app.
Of course,
Where within the resident app, residents are able to stay connected with their neighbors. So they can message their neighbors, they can post on a social feed. That's going to get you way further along when it comes to building a sense of community than spending like $3,000 on a one-time event or $100 on a one-time event. So that 24-hour engagement literally is 24-hour engagement. Residents are going to be able to message, talk, connect, and stay connected like much, much longer than the 1 or 2 events that you do per month. So as people kind of think about like whether it's to add a new budget item or just to move a budget item over, digital engagement is just as important as that in-person communication.
Okay, I love that. And thank you. I think that will be very helpful for our multifamily marketers that are listening. I think we're about out of time, but I just wanted to go ahead and recap kind of like what I'm going to take away from this conversation, because there were so many amazing things. But I think a couple of things that really stuck out to me were, one, like, let's say our goals out loud, right? Like, let's not be satisfied with a 50% retention rate. Let's say out loud, okay, next year, we're going to focus on getting 5% more, retaining 5% more. It doesn't have to go from 50 to 75, right? Like you can, or whatever your retention rate is internally, but you can set little goals and just start chipping away at it. So I think setting a goal, saying it out loud, making it reasonable and reachable, and then actually doing the research into understanding where is our retention currently falling short and how can we fix it? And whether that means a new budget item or shifting budget, but understanding your residents at those key touch points. And typically, if you already have a surveying tool in place, it's easy enough to add additional touch points. So, again, I heard you say like almost over survey your customers. I know for us, we survey our residents at 2 touch points, and we've found that sometimes the response rates aren't very high. So the data that we have is a small sample, but I think if we go back and add in additional surveys, that just gives us, one, it gives us a picture across the resident kind of lifespan, but 2, it gives us more data in general because we're going to get more responses. So I think that's something.
One thing I found funny on the survey side, I think to your point, is that some of the reasons that people get like lower responses is simply because the survey frequency isn't there. And one of the most interesting things is, and it's just human nature, people tend to provide feedback more readily when they are unhappy. So when you send out a survey, the happy residents are not, they were like, I don't really have a reason to respond. But when they have a complaint because something happened within the last couple of days, they're like, yeah, I need to tell you this happened. So you are going to get a lot more of those like negatives, but it's a good thing because people are more willing to provide feedback when something bad happened. And that allows you to capture more of the like negative things that happen and then take care of them.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Just asking, and then the one time that they're ready, you're in front of them. So I love that. And again, the more data, the better. And then finally, I think my last takeaway from our conversation was really around the branding and putting the property management company first, building a brand for your property management company. And, I know, again, Gold is kind of setting the standard and they went really, really big. But then your example about a property management company sponsoring a volleyball tournament, like that's obtainable for a majority of property management companies. And so I love how you gave us a practical application for property management companies to be able to build a brand. And then, it's important to think about, well, how is that being built into the residents, the property, and then the residents' experience as well. So it's just carrying through. So I'm really excited to take everything I've learned from you and go to work tomorrow and think about, how can I change the world? I hope our listeners are.
I love it.
I mean, it's so fun. It's so inspiring to hear other perspectives. And, you bring a lot to the industry. Flamingo is such a great product. Everyone, please go check it out. Jude, thank you for spending Sunday morning with us. I really appreciate it. And until next time, this has been the Apartment Department. Thank you.